Hi, I'm Nick Hague, and I'm the host of the World's Greatest Business Thinkers podcast. And today I'm with Paul, and I'm going to talk about competition frameworks. Wouldn't life be wonderful in business if there was no competition? Competitors eat our lunch, steal all our ideas, and they're always trying to steal our customers, of course. I think we should start today by just talking about the competitive environment and if there are any benefits to having competitors. What's your thoughts on this?
We started in business many years ago, Nick, in a small suburb of Manchester called Bramhall. And at the time, there was just one restaurant. We used to go there occasionally at lunchtime, and it was okay. And then very shortly after that, maybe within a year or two, another restaurant appeared. And we used both restaurants. And what we noted was that the first restaurant improved quite a bit in the food and the service that it provided. And the second restaurant was pretty good. And over the years that we were in Bramhall, perhaps another 6 restaurants appeared. And it became a place where people would go to eat out because the standard of food was good, the service was good. And it occurred to us that it was the competition there that made these restaurants good. In other words, competitors keep you on your toes. You might not like it. You might like to be in that monopoly position where you have it all to yourself, but actually you become a better company if there are competitors around. And I note actually that there are a lot of trades where there are competitors around. So if you want to buy a car, for example, franchise dealers are often on the same road just going out of town. In Manchester, where we're based, there's streets given over to the fabric industry, the textile industry, where designers and things that you can buy for the fabric that you're making or the designs that you're making are located in that position. In New York and London, you get banks and financial institutions down Wall Street or in particular parts of the city. And it's although these companies are in competition against each other in some way, there's also a synergy there. You know, that if it's easier to recruit people in that industry because, you know, if you want a job as a chef or a waiter, you can come to Bramhall. If you want a job in the finance industry, you go to Wall Street or you go to the City of London. So there are advantages having competition around.
Yeah, and you get whole cities, don't you? In China, for example.
China, where they make particular products.
Yeah, and so you're right. I mean, it drives companies to be more innovative, doesn't it? Offering that better product or service leads to higher quality, and sometimes, you know, lower prices, definitely increased customer choice. In fact, I spoke with Chip Conley on the World's Greatest Business Thinkers podcast, and he talked to me about what it was like to grow the global brand that is Airbnb alongside Brian Chesky. But they didn't have it all their own way in the first few years, and actually after the first few years that when they'd launched, a company in Europe called Wimdu, they launched, wanted a piece of the pie, and they grew rapidly. Actually, they overtook Airbnb in terms of revenues in the early days. They had a big investment, but it was at this point that Airbnb, you know, they could have been history, but however, it was this competition that pushed Brian Chesky and his co-founders to just blitzscale everything, take on more market share, accept more investment, and overtake Wimdu. And of course, you know, the rest is history, and everyone knows about Airbnb. So it is good for companies. It does drive in terms of innovation and healthy competition. Is good for all. I can imagine that the starting point with all competition frameworks is research, finding out what's going on at the competition, so that we can go around and you know, head them off at the pass should we know what they're doing. Can you talk to us about how we should go about building a detailed picture of our competitors?
Well, there's some very obvious sources. There's a plethora of information, intelligence about our competitors out there. I mean, a website, the competitor's website, is always a good starting point. And if you just Google the competitor, you'll probably get a lot of notes on the news that about that particular competitor. Social media gives you inputs on what the competition are doing. So there's a lot there that you can do from your desk. There's also a huge amount of intelligence on competitors that's randomly scattered within companies. So I would imagine sales and marketing people will know a lot of specifics about their competition. Technical people within the company where you work probably know a lot about what's happening technically in the competition. These random bits of intelligence, unfortunately, stay within the heads of the people in the company, and they don't necessarily get brought together. And I think a lot of the strength of competitor intelligence is the way you collect and analyze the data rather than leaving it in random bits around the company or in people's heads around the company.
Mm.
It always strikes me as unusual that a CEO of a company doesn't sit down with their intelligence chief once a week and say, what's the news? The news on the markets in which they're operating, where the intelligence group will know what's happening, but particularly in terms of the competition. What are they doing that we ought to know about, rather than just leaving it to chance? So I think competitor intelligence is not only about collecting the information, but it's a way you present it in a regular way to the leaders within the organization, so they know what's happening.
Yeah, yeah. Once we have that detailed picture of the competitive landscape, what's our next step? Are there any frameworks that we should think of now?
There are lots of frameworks. I mean, competitive intelligence itself is a framework. So we'd say go to the website, have a look about how you do competitive intelligence. But then there's all sorts of benchmarking frameworks that you could get into. There's some very obvious ones that we used to work with all the time, such as customer satisfaction or the Net Promoter Score, where you're not only looking at your score that you've achieved in customer satisfaction, but you're looking at that of the competitors as well. So knowing what you want to find out from the competition, what you want to measure against, is an important starting point. Once you have got a lot of market intelligence, you might then want to develop your strategy. How do we fight or be more successful than this competitor? And there are a number of frameworks here that can help us. Mintzberg, Henry Mintzberg in 1987, he presented a paper where he got 5 Ps, different ways that you can develop a strategy for competing against the competition. So, the obvious and the starting point of Mintzberg's 5 Ps was that you had a plan, a sequential plan. We'll do step number 1, step number 2, step number 3, and that'll take us to where we're going against the competition. But he also talked about other specific ways you can beat the competition. He mentioned Harley Davidson, for example, where they are manufacturers of luxury, very heavy bikes in the States. And that's the point, that they specialized in a niche. And they decided that they didn't want to compete necessarily head on with Honda, or who made a range of bikes, or Suzuki, who made sports bikes, but they would make these touring bikes, these luxury bikes. And that was their strategy. And then Southwest Airlines is always worth thinking about how culturally they in terms of their strategy, decided that they would set up a culture of perhaps you could call it humor almost, in the way that they ran their airline, where they would joke with the passengers and be friendly with the passengers. All led by Herb Kelleher, who was, their CEO and a bit of a joke man himself. He wrote a book called Nuts, if you remember, and in which he described how so there are strategies that you can then develop once you know where the competition is. You won't be a boring legacy airline. You'll be a sort of fun airline, like Southwest Airlines, and very successfully so.
Yeah, yeah, and as you know, I was head of growth for an agency within the Dentsu network in a previous life, and Dentsu, Japanese agency, Japanese organization, and I always remember they had this saying "Sampo Yoshi," which means 3-way satisfaction in Japanese, ensuring that every activity we do is good for business, good for people, and good for society. And you're talking about frameworks, talking about strategy. I really like the 3 C's framework, which again it kind of builds on that triangulation of Japanese thoughts and way of doing the art of Japanese business. So the 3Cs, looking at I think it was from a book called The Mind of the Strategist, The Art of Japanese Business. But 3Cs is customers, competitors, and the company itself. And it's about, the triangulation of bringing these together in order to look at, from a competitor angle, obviously how they're making money, what do we need to do to beat them, from the customer's angle, who are they, what do they value, what can we offer them, and then from the company perspective, understanding internally within your strengths and your unique selling points, and then from that intersection of the three, you build your strategy. I always really liked that as a particular framework for.
Well, in a way, what you're describing there is, Nick, is something that the Boston Consulting Group, BCG, wrote a paper on. They called it the Competitive Advantage Matrix. And they've got two axes in this matrix. On the y-axis, they said, how many differentiating opportunities have you got? And on the x-axis, they've got the size of competitive advantage that would give you. So, for example, if you're looking at a company and you might say, well, we've looked internally at ourselves, and actually we don't seem to be a lot better than the competition on anything. Then you haven't got that many opportunities there for getting competitive advantage. So what you might do is choose something like culture, which you can develop. It becomes your own competitive advantage. You single it out, and then very specifically you work on that, as you sort of described Dentsu doing. And maybe in Dentsu's case, it became its size. I mean, Dentsu is huge. In Japan, it's massive, massive. And of course, it's global as well as a supplier. So its size gives it a competitive advantage, which allows it then to sort of transmit that culture in order to benefit and gain a competitive advantage over other agencies.
Yeah. I think what we're saying is that, and we've said it before in these other videos, haven't we, that there's not just one framework. Sometimes you need other frameworks that sit within segmentation, competitor intelligence. But in order to get that competitive advantage, it's about the analysis and looking at those small advantages which offer that advantage over the competition. So if
people mentioning Michael Porter, I mean, he always gets mentioned in terms of frameworks because he developed quite a few, but he had a framework called Porter's 5 Forces. So he said that when you're looking at the competitive environment, there are 5 forces that are affecting you as a company and affecting the competitors. And you ought to be aware of those 5 forces so that you can work out which one is affecting the competition most and affecting you least, if you like. And his 5 forces were rivalry. That was the starting one. To what extent do we actually meet in a continuous way in the marketplace? And some companies are meeting all the time and some are only meeting infrequently. So what's the extent of the rivalry? And then he'd talk about the bargaining power of suppliers. Some companies are under the cosh of the supplier, and they can't do much because the supplier controls them in a way, and other people have got a lot of choice. So where do you sit in terms of your bargaining in terms of suppliers? And then he would talk about substitutes, which can be a threat. The substitutes out there which could be used for your product instead of the one that you're making. And what about the competitors? Are they subject to the same sort of threats? And then he talked about new entrants. Could they come into the market? And he talked finally about the power of buyers, the people who you're selling to. If you're a food company selling to supermarkets, you usually are quite small relative to the supermarkets. They have the power, you don't, so if your business is selling to supermarkets and your competitors aren't selling to supermarkets, how are you going to deal with that? So have a look at Porter's 5 Forces. It's worth thinking about when you're developing a strategy against the competition.
Yeah. Well, Porter's 5 Forces, we've mentioned a couple of other frameworks, the 3Cs being one of those, Net Promoter Score, but there's loads, of course. Where should people go if they want to look at more around competitive frameworks?
Well, go to our website. There's more than 100 different frameworks on there, but there are 40 specific ones on looking at the competition, or there are 40 where some elements of what you're looking at could give you a competitive advantage. So that's the place to go.
Excellent. Thanks for your time today, Paul.
Thanks, Nick.